Shadows of a city and secrets long buried. The cracked sidewalk was still damp from a brief afternoon shower, the puddles reflecting the fading light of dusk. Elena Ramirez walked briskly, her thin sneakers slapping against the concrete with every hurried step. Her cleaning shift at the Regal Heights Towers started in less than 30 minutes, and she still had to drop off her daughter, Sophia, at Mrs. Pina's cramped apartment 2 blocks away. The air smelled faintly of fried onions and wet asphalt. The city never truly rested, even in this quieter neighborhood where second-hand furniture stores leaned against pawn shops and the streetlights flickered more often than they glowed. Elena adjusted the strap of her worn canvas bag on her shoulder. Inside were cleaning supplies she paid for herself. Little things the company didn't cover but made her job slightly easier. A ragged pair of rubber gloves, a half-empty bottle of lemon-scented disinfectant, and a sewing kit because uniforms ripped constantly, and there was no budget for replacements. Sophia's small hand clutched hers tightly, the girl's wide brown eyes scanning every window they passed. From bakeries with stale bread stacked in baskets to the laundromat where the machines shuddered and groaned like tired old men. Sophia was only 7, her shoes scuffed from playground games, and her backpack weighed down with schoolbooks, and her ever-present stuffed lamb, Lily, with one ear slightly chewed from years of comfort. "Are we gonna have spaghetti for dinner tomorrow?" Sophia asked, skipping to avoid a crack in the pavement. "If we get a special coupon, maybe," Elena said with a smile that hid her exhaustion. "Otherwise, it's tuna and rice." Sophia made a face, wrinkling her nose in exaggerated disgust. "Tuna smells like feet." Elena laughed softly, the sound surprising even herself. In this narrow corridor between worry and exhaustion, Sophia's innocence was her only light. They reached Mrs. Pina's building, a sagging brick rectangle with faded shutters, and a crooked mailbox. Elena's knuckles rapped gently on the apartment door, and after a minute, the familiar creak of floorboards signaled Mrs. Pina's approach. The door swung open, revealing the older woman in her floral housecoat, glasses perched low on her nose, her face tight with concern. "Elena," she said with hesitation, her hands fidgeting in the folds of her dress. "I need to talk to you." Elena's stomach clenched. Conversations that started that way were rarely good. "I can't watch Sophia tonight." Mrs. Pina's voice was apologetic but firm. "My sister's boy is staying over. We've got no space." The air seemed to thin around Elena. "Please, just for a few hours. I can pay extra." "I'm sorry, Mija. I can't." Sophia's small hand tugged at Elena's sleeve. "Can I come with you, Mama? I'll be quiet like a ninja." Elena's instinct was to say no, to keep her daughter away from the polished, sterile world of Regal Heights Tower, where executives never noticed the people scrubbing their floors. But there was no other option. Rent was due, and every hour counted. "Okay," she said, kneeling to cup Sophia's cheek, "but you have to stay close to me. No wandering." Sophia nodded solemnly. "I promise." The towering glass monolith of Regal Heights loomed above them, its mirrored surface reflecting the last streaks of sunlight. Sophia craned her neck, eyes wide. "It's like a castle in the clouds." Elena tugged her daughter's hand gently. "It's just a building, baby." Inside, the marble floors shone like water, and the air was cold enough to make Sophia shiver. They passed men in tailored suits, their shoes tapping in confident, purposeful rhythms. None of them spared a glance at the cleaner and her daughter. At the janitor's closet on the 11th floor, Elena laid out a clean patch of towel for Sophia to sit on. "Stay here," she said, brushing a curl from her daughter's face. "If anyone sees you, pretend you're invisible." Sophia clutched Lily the lamb tightly. "I'm a ninja." Elena pressed a kiss to her forehead, then slipped into the hallway with her cleaning cart, her footsteps silent as she started her nightly rounds. At the top of the building, behind a pair of gleaming mahogany doors, a boardroom bathed in muted light hummed with tension. Damon Whittaker, CEO of Whittaker Global Holdings, stood at the head of the table, his hands braced on the polished surface. His salt and pepper hair was combed with ruthless precision, his cufflinks discreetly gleaming against the soft fabric of his tailored charcoal suit. "Projections for Q3 are unacceptable," he said, voice low but lethal. "We don't pay for conservative estimates. We pay for results." The room's occupants shifted uncomfortably. No one dared meet his gaze. They all knew Damon's reputation. He built empires by gutting them first, carving out inefficiencies like tumors, no matter how deeply they were rooted. Robert Klein, his chief financial officer, adjusted his tie, his forehead damp. "With market volatility and the merger, sir, we wanted to account for potential weakness," Damon cut in. "That's not our brand." The door to the boardroom creaked open. Sophia stood there, half hidden by the massive door, her lamb clutched tightly to her chest. Her big brown eyes locked onto Damon. For a long beat, the room froze. Sophia's voice, small but clear, rang out. "Daddy." A stunned silence followed, thick and absolute. The only sound was the whisper of air conditioning and the distant hum of city traffic far below. Damon's face went white. The polished exterior, years in the making, fractured in an instant. His jaw tightened, but his voice faltered when he finally spoke. "What did you say?" "Daddy." Sophia took a hesitant step into the room. "It's you." "I know it." Alina burst into the room a second later, her face flushed with panic, her cleaning gloves still damp. "Sophia." Her voice trembled with both fear and fury. She grabbed her daughter's arm, trying to pull her back, but Sophia planted her feet. "I'm sorry, Mr. Whittaker," Alina said breathlessly. "She's not supposed to be here. We'll leave." But Damon wasn't looking at Alina. His gaze was locked on Sophia, more specifically on the locket swinging from her neck. A small silver oval etched with a rose, the exact locket Damon had given to a woman long ago, a woman named Isabel. He hadn't seen that locket in over 8 years. Alina saw the recognition flash in his eyes and stepped protectively in front of Sophia. "We don't want anything from you." Damon's throat worked as he tried to summon the ruthless CEO mask, but it wouldn't settle. Not with that locket dangling between them like a ghost. "Who are you?" His voice was low, almost hoarse. "Alina Ramirez," she said, her chin lifting defiantly despite her pounding heart. "You knew my sister, Isabel." The room spun. Alina's face, those familiar eyes, the stubborn tilt of her chin, combined with the locket and Sophia's innocent certainty, forced memories to surface. The summer he'd spent with Isabel. The nights filled with laughter and whispered dreams. The fights over his career, his coldness, his refusal to choose love over ambition. Then the final silence after he walked away, leaving Isabel behind. "I don't have a daughter," Damon said, the words hollow even to his own ears. Alina's face darkened with fury, but Sophia's small voice pierced through. "Mama says I do." The board members, eager to escape the storm brewing in their boss's eyes, slipped quietly from the room, leaving only the three of them. Damon stared at the girl who had called him Daddy, her wide eyes shimmering with hurt and hope. The ruthless businessman could have denied it all. But the ghost of Isabel, the weight of the locket, and the innocent faith in Sophia's gaze held him captive. Alina's voice was low but clear. "She's yours." Damon Whittaker's world, a world built on power, control, and calculated decisions, trembled under the weight of a truth he couldn't outrun. The cost of silence. Damon Whittaker stood frozen in the now silent boardroom, the gleaming mahogany table reflecting his own face back at him, a face he no longer recognized. The polished CEO, the calculating negotiator, the king of mergers. None of those titles meant a damn thing when confronted with the wide-eyed gaze of a little girl clutching a stuffed lamb and calling him Daddy. Sophia's small, scuffed sneakers barely made a sound as she shifted her weight, her hands clasping the locket at her neck with the innocent certainty only a child could possess. Damon's gaze couldn't leave it, that silver oval etched with a delicate rose. something fragile that had somehow survived years of neglect and absence. Alina's voice broke through the suffocating silence. "She's yours, Damon, whether you like it or not." His chest tightened at the sound of her voice, steady, low, but vibrating with a barely contained fury she had every right to feel. Delina Ramirez. Her name hadn't passed his lips in over 8 years. He barely remembered the younger sister, always in Isabel's shadow, the quieter, gentler one with the serious eyes. And now here she stood, worn uniform, trembling hands, but standing tall between him and the child he never knew existed. Damon's fingers twitched at his sides, his usual arsenal of responses. Threats, dismissals, legal loopholes, failing him for the first time in years. His voice, when it finally came, sounded like someone else's. This can't be possible." Alina let out a dry, humorless laugh. "You can run your financial empire, but you can't do math. Sophia's 7, Damon. 7. Isabel found out after you left." The name, Isabel, hit him like a punch to the gut. The taste of summer came rushing back, jasmine-scented nights, and whispered promises he'd been too ambitious to believe in. Her dark eyes, always full of fire and tenderness, haunted him in an instant. And then came the cold memory of his own retreat, choosing a boardroom over a family, cutting Isabel out of his life like trimming fat from a budget. He told himself at the time it was cleaner that way. Cleaner didn't mean better. "What do you want?" His voice was sharp, not from anger, but because vulnerability tasted like poison. Elena stepped forward, her daughter's hand still clasped tightly in hers. "I want you to look at her," she said softly. "Really look at her, because she's been waiting for you her whole life." Damon's gaze finally traveled from the locket to Sophia's face, the soft curve of her cheeks, the way her dark curls framed her forehead, the eyes that held too much hope for such a small girl. Isabel's eyes. For a moment, the mask of CEO Damon Whittaker cracked, and something raw and unguarded flickered in his expression. Fear, regret, maybe even longing. But just as quickly, he slammed the door shut. "I'll have my legal team contact you," he said coldly. "If she's mine, we'll arrange something. Financial support, school, health care." Alina's grip on Sophia's hand tightened until her knuckles blanched. "She doesn't need your money." Damon turned away, unable to look at the child who still hadn't stopped watching him, her lamb hugged tightly to her chest. "Everyone needs money." Alina shook her head, her voice trembling but clear. "That's all you've ever understood, isn't it?" Without another word, she turned, guiding Sophia out the door. Sophia kept glancing over her shoulder, still waiting, still hoping, until the door swung shut behind them. Damon stood alone, the gleaming boardroom suddenly too quiet, too cold, his own reflection in the polished wood looking like a stranger. Hours later, Alina's apartment. The lock stuck, as always, and Alina had to jiggle her key twice before the old door groaned open. Their small apartment smelled of warm rice and laundry detergent, the scent oddly comforting after the cold gleam of Regal Heights Tower. Sophia's sneakers squeaked faintly as she crossed the worn linoleum, her shoulders sagging under the weight of the night's events. Alina set her cleaning bag down, her hands trembling slightly as she peeled off her damp uniform jacket. Her mind raced, fragments of past and present colliding like a train wreck. Isabel's smile, so bright even when money was tight. Isabel's tears, silent the day Damon walked away. The hospital bills Elena couldn't pay when Isabel got sick. The final promise Elena made, standing at her sister's bedside, clutching Sophia, barely a year old, against her chest. "I'll keep her safe." Elena had worked double shifts, skipped meals, and stitched together a life from scraps to keep that promise. Damon's absence had been a gift in some ways. No messy custody battles, no half-hearted visits. Just peace, even if it was hard-earned. But Sophia had questions, more and more lately. Why don't I have a daddy like the other kids? Did he not want me? Was I bad? Elena had answered the best she could, But the weight of those questions had settled in Sophia's bones, giving her a quiet kind of sadness Elena couldn't wash away. "Mama." Sophia's voice was small, hesitant. Elena turned, trying to summon her usual smile. "Yes, baby." "Do you think he remembers me now?" Elena knelt beside her, brushing a damp curl from Sophia's forehead. "I don't know," she said honestly. "But whether he remembers or not, you are worth remembering." Sophia nodded slowly, but her fingers traced the outline of her locket, her expression thoughtful in that way only children possess, hopeful even after heartbreak. Meanwhile, Damon's penthouse. Damon poured 2 fingers of scotch into a crystal glass, the amber liquid catching the faint glow of the city skyline beyond his floor-to-ceiling windows. The glass trembled faintly in his hand before he set it down, untouched. The locket haunted him. Isabel had worn it every day that summer, her fingers always reaching for it when she was thinking or nervous. He'd joked that it was her lucky charm. "You're my lucky charm," she'd whispered once, tracing his jaw with her fingertips. He kissed her instead of answering, because words felt dangerous back then, like something permanent. Love had seemed like a distraction, something that would pull him off course, derail his perfectly laid plans. He hadn't known love could be the foundation, not the obstacle. On his desk lay a confidential folder his assistant had delivered, sealed until now. Inside were documents, paternity test orders, a full background check on Elena Ramirez, school records for Sophia, even an old obituary for Isabel. Damon's hands shook slightly as he unfolded the obituary, Isabel's smiling face printed in black and white, her eyes still full of fire even in the grainy photo. She had been only 28. Gone. His stomach twisted at the realization that he hadn't even known. He'd been sealing a deal in Tokyo the week she died. There was a picture at the bottom. Elena holding a baby with a mop of dark curls, the tiny hand clutching a familiar silver locket. Damon closed the folder, his throat tight. For the first time in years, no financial statement or corporate conquest could silence the hollow ache in his chest. Late that night, Elena's apartment. Elena sat at the tiny kitchen table, bills spread in front of her like a game she was destined to lose. Sophia was asleep, her lamb tucked under one arm, her face peaceful for now. The knock at the door startled her. She opened it to find Damon standing there, tie loosened, the scotch still untasted on his breath. "What are you doing here?" Elena's voice was wary, protective. He held out the folder, his jaw tight. "I didn't know." Elena's expression softened for just a moment before the years of hurt hardened her again. "You didn't want to know." They stood there, the weight of 8 years pressing between them, and somewhere in the silence, a fragile thread of understanding stretched taut. "I want to know her," Damon said quietly. "If you'll let me." Elena's heart ached for Sophia, for Isabel, for herself. She should say no. She knew better. But the tiny, flickering hope in Sophia's eyes gave her the strength to say, "Then prove it." The unwritten chapter. The door to Elena's apartment closed with a soft click, but the silence that followed was deafening. Damon stood in the narrow entryway, so far out of place in this small, worn space that Elena almost laughed. His polished shoes rested on a faded doormat that read "Welcome," the letters worn thin from years of foot traffic. The crisp lines of his tailored shirts stood in contrast to the peeling wallpaper and the scuffed linoleum floor. Damon Whittaker didn't belong here, and yet here he was. Elena didn't offer him a seat. She didn't ask if he wanted water or coffee. She stood with her arms crossed, her spine straight, her eyes narrowed just enough to make it clear he was here on borrowed time. "You said you want to know her," Elena said, her voice low to avoid waking Sophia in the next room. "What does that mean to you exactly?" Damon's hands found his pockets, his fingers curling into fists. "I want to meet her properly. Not in a boardroom, not in the middle of my work life. Just meet her." Elena's arms stayed crossed. "And then what?" "Buy her a pony. Drop in once a month between mergers and deals." His jaw tightened, but there was no anger in his voice when he answered. I don't know what it looks like yet. I'm not going to pretend I have all the answers." That surprised her. The Damon she remembered, Isabel's Damon, always had a plan, a spreadsheet, a contingency strategy. Admitting uncertainty was not his style. "You're right," he added after a moment. "I walked away from Isabel. I didn't know she was pregnant, but even if I had—" His voice trailed off, the weight of the truth too ugly to say out loud. Alina's heart twisted. The truth was clear enough. He would have walked away anyway. She wanted to slam the door in his face, to protect Sophia the way she always had. But the memory of her daughter's wide, hopeful eyes, her belief that her father was out there somewhere, just waiting to find her, kept Alina's voice steady. "You can meet her," she said, "but on my terms." "Fair enough." Damon exhaled slowly. "What are your terms?" "You show up. Every time. No excuses. No disappearing acts." "I will." And she added, her voice sharper, "You leave your money and your lawyers out of it. If you're here as her father, not as Damon Whitaker, CEO." That part, Damon knew, would be harder than it sounded. His wealth was his armor, his power his shield. Stripped of that, who was he? "Agreed," he said, though his stomach tightened at the vulnerability that came with it. Alina uncrossed her arms, reluctantly stepping aside. "You can see her tomorrow after school." That was it. No further invitation, no handshake, just a narrow path forward that Damon would have to walk carefully. The next afternoon, the school gate. Damon stood awkwardly outside the chain-link fence, his hands stuffed in the pockets of a casual jacket that still somehow managed to look expensive. Parents gathered in clusters, chatting about bake sales and fundraisers, trading gossip over paper cups of coffee. Damon was as out of place here as a shark in a koi pond. The bell rang, and the school doors burst open, releasing a flood of children into the courtyard. They ran in every direction, backpacks swinging, voices high and eager. Damon searched for Sophia, though he wasn't sure he'd recognize her right away without the stuffed lamb or her mother nearby. But he didn't need to search for long. Sophia spotted him first. Her small face froze in a mixture of surprise and awe, as though she couldn't quite believe he was real. For a moment, she stood still, her sneakers planted firmly on the cracked pavement. Then, slowly, she took a step toward him. Damon felt something break in his chest. He'd sat through countless high-stakes negotiations, had stood his ground against billion-dollar investors, and none of that had made his hands shake the way this tiny girl's hesitant approach did. "Hi," he said, his voice rough with unfamiliar emotion. I'm Damon." Her nose wrinkled. That's a weird name for a daddy. A startled laugh escaped him, raw and unguarded. "You can call me whatever you want." Sophia tilted her head, considering. "Can I call you?" She paused dramatically, eyes sparkling with mischief. "Captain Pickle." Damon blinked. "Captain Pickle?" "Lily, my lamb, said I should pick a funny name. Serious names are boring." Something in his chest eased, the humor cutting through the stiffness he hadn't realized he carried. "Captain Pickle it is." Sophia giggled, her curls bouncing with the movement, and without thinking, she slipped her small hand into his much larger one. Damon stared down at the connection, struck dumb by the simplicity of it. She didn't know who he was. Not really. All she knew was that he'd shown up. And for her, that was enough. For now. An awkward start. They walked the 3 blocks back to the apartment, Sophia chatting the entire way about her teacher, her best friend Anaya, and how she was pretty sure the class hamster was part ninja. Damon listened, offering a nod or a question here and there, his throat tight with the strange sensation of unfamiliar fatherhood. When they reached the apartment, Alina opened the door, her expression guarded as her eyes flicked from Sophia's bright face to Damon's stiff posture. "She picked my name," Damon said, trying and failing to sound casual. "Captain Pickle." Alina's brow lifted. "That sounds about right." Sophia dragged Damon into the living room, her excitement bubbling over. "Come see my drawings. I drew a family picture, but left a space because..." She clamped her hands over her mouth, her eyes darting nervously to Alina. "Because I was waiting to fill it in." Alina's throat tightened, but she didn't interrupt. Damon knelt beside Sophia's art table, carefully examining her crayon creations. Bright colors spilled across the page. Alina with her dark hair and tired smile, Sophia with her ever-present lamb, and a blank space between them. Damon's voice was soft. "Think I could fit right here?" Sophia nodded solemnly. "But you have to draw yourself. Those are the rules." The CEO of Whittaker Global Holdings picked up a purple crayon, Sophia's choice, and with far more effort than he'd ever invested in a quarterly report, he drew himself. It wasn't good. Sophia giggled at the lopsided stick figure with hair that stuck out like seaweed. "You look like a broccoli." Damon laughed, the sound echoing through the small apartment, warming its corners in a way money never could. Later that night, after Sophia was tucked into bed, her soft breathing filling the silence, Alina stood at the kitchen sink, scrubbing dishes with more force than necessary. Damon stood in the doorway, hands in his pockets again, watching her. "She's amazing," he said quietly. Alina didn't turn. "She's been amazing since the day she was born." He took a breath. "I want to do this right, Alina. I know I can't make up for..." "No," she interrupted, her voice sharp. "You can't." Silence stretched between them, thick with history. "But," she added, softer this time, "you can be here now." Damon swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest. "I will." Alina finally looked at him, her defenses still high but her eyes softening just a fraction. "We'll see." He nodded, accepting that "we'll see" was the best he could get right now. It was more than he deserved. As Damon left the apartment, stepping into the cool night air, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. The climb ahead would be steep. Trust wasn't given, it was earned. But for the first time, he wanted to earn something that couldn't be measured in profit margins or stock prices. He wanted to earn his daughter. Building bridges from broken pieces. The Saturday sun streamed through the smudged windows of Alina's apartment, filling the small living room with honey-colored light. Sophia sat cross-legged on the floor, her crayons scattered around her in a wild rainbow. At the center of her latest masterpiece was a new addition, a tall stick figure with squiggly hair, a lopsided smile, and scrawled in 7-year-old handwriting beneath it, Captain Pickle. Alina stood by the window, her arms folded, watching Damon struggle to assemble a plastic dollhouse on the carpet. The pieces were stubborn, some mismatched, others missing entirely. Damon's brow furrowed in concentration, his expensive watch catching the light as he tried, unsuccessfully, to attach a crooked balcony to the side. "Need help?" Alina asked, amusement tugging at her mouth despite herself. Damon exhaled sharply, glaring at the tiny pink piece in his hand like it was a hostile negotiator. "I've closed billion-dollar deals in under an hour. But this..." He held up the offending piece. "This is my Everest." Sophia giggled, her eyes sparkling with delight. "You have to wiggle it, not push it," she instructed, crawling closer and effortlessly snapping the piece into place. Damon blinked. "Clearly, you're the brains of this operation." "She's got a lot of practice," Alina said softly, though her voice was tinged with pride. "She's been putting her toys together herself for a while now." Damon's smile faded slightly. There was no accusation in Alina's voice, but the reminder of all the years he'd missed landed heavily in his chest. Years he couldn't get back. Instead of retreating into guilt, Damon leaned forward, holding out another piece. "What's next, boss?" Sophia grinned, taking the piece with the exaggerated seriousness only a child could manage. "The tower." Damon nodded, and together they built, piece by piece, small steps. Over the next few weeks, Damon became a fixture in Sophia's world, though not always comfortably. The first time he tried to make her breakfast, he nearly set the toaster on fire, resulting in a shriek of alarm from Sophia and uncontrollable laughter from Alina. The first time he helped with homework, he over-explained long division until Sophia fell asleep with her head on the kitchen table, her pencil still in hand. The first time he picked her up from school, his car, a sleek black luxury sedan, threw stares from both students and parents alike. Sophia, unfazed, climbed in and immediately started playing with the buttons, oblivious to the disapproving looks aimed their way. "Do all rich people's cars smell like leather and soap?" Sophia asked, wrinkling her nose. Damon glanced at her. "Probably. Can we roll down the windows so it smells like pizza instead?" Damon laughed, a real, unguarded laugh, and hit the button. The wind whipped through Sophia's curls as she stuck her arm out the window, pretending to fly. The cracks in Alina's walls. At first, Alina watched Damon's visits like a hawk, her arms folded, her body language rigid with mistrust. She hovered at the edges of every interaction, waiting for the inevitable disappointment, the day he'd slip back into his corporate world and leave them behind. But day after day, Damon returned. Not always graceful, not always sure of himself, but always present. He helped Sophia build blanket forts in the living room. He took her to the park, pushing her on the swings until his arms ached. He even sat through her favorite cartoon, a pastel explosion of talking animals, and made up ridiculous backstories for each character until Sophia was in tears from laughter. One night, Alina stood in the doorway of Sophia's room, watching Damon tuck her in. His voice, soft, unfamiliar to her ears, read the same bedtime story Sophia had heard 100 times. But this time, with Damon's silly voices and exaggerated gestures, the story came alive in a way it never had before. Alina's heart ached at the sight, not just for what Sophia had missed, but for the pieces of herself she'd locked away for so long. A life he didn't recognize. Damon's penthouse felt colder every time he returned to it. The sleek, minimalist furniture no longer felt impressive, just empty. The walls of glass offered a stunning view, but it only reminded him how high he built his life above the world, and how disconnected he'd become from anything real. There were no drawings on his refrigerator, no stuffed animals perched on his couch, no sticky fingerprints on the windows. The silence used to be comforting. Now it was suffocating. His assistant, Claire, noticed the change almost immediately. "Your schedule's been light," she commented carefully one morning as she placed a stack of papers on his desk. "The board is curious." Damon barely glanced up. "Let them wonder." Claire hesitated. "The shareholders are concerned about the delayed merger. They expect a statement soon." He nodded, distracted, his mind somewhere else entirely. "I'll handle it," he said. But he didn't move to make the call. Not right away. Because for the first time, the future of Whittaker Global wasn't the only future he cared about. The first real test. It was a Thursday evening when Alina's phone rang, the screen flashing Damon's name. She almost didn't answer, but something told her to pick up. "Hey," his voice was tight. "I'm stuck in a meeting. I might not make it for dinner." Alina's grip on the phone tightened. She knew this script. This was how it started, with small cancellations, creeping excuses. "Okay," she said flatly. "I'll tell Sophia." The disappointment was subtle, but it was there. And Damon heard it. "I'll try," he said, softer this time. "I really will." "Trying isn't enough," Alina replied before hanging up. Damon stared at the phone, guilt gnawing at him, but old instincts kicked in. The deal had to come first. It always had. A child's quiet heartbreak. Sophia sat at the kitchen table, her crayons scattered around her, drawing a new picture, a castle, with herself and Alina standing at the gates. There was a third figure near the castle wall, halfway drawn, but she left it unfinished. "Is Captain Pickle coming for dinner?" she asked without looking up. Alina swallowed the lump in her throat. "Not tonight, baby. He's working." Sophia's fingers paused over her crayon, but she didn't say anything. She just kept coloring, the bright castle suddenly less magical, the meeting that didn't matter. Damon sat at the head of a long conference table, surrounded by suited executives, droning on about projections and risk assessments. The numbers blurred in front of him, their importance fading with each tick of the clock. In his mind, he saw Sophia's face, the way her eyes lit up when he walked in the door, the way her hand automatically reached for his. He stood up, cutting off the speaker mid-sentence. Damon, Robert, his longest-serving board member, looked startled. "Where are you going?" "Home," Damon said simply. And for the first time in his life, home wasn't a penthouse. Dinner at the Ramirez apartment. The knock came just as Alina was serving plates of pasta. She opened the door to find Damon standing there, slightly breathless, his tie loosened, his sleeves rolled up. "I'm sorry I'm late," he said, "but I'm here." Sophia's face lit up, the flicker of doubt replaced by sheer joy. "Captain Pickle." He grinned. "You didn't start without me, did you?" Alina stood back, letting him in, her own heart caught somewhere between relief and guarded hope. They ate together, crowded around the small table, elbows bumping, laughter filling the room. Damon's suit jacket hung on the back of a chair, forgotten. His phone stayed in his pocket. Sophia chattered endlessly, spinning stories about school and cartoons, and why spaghetti tasted better when you slurped it. And Damon listened, really listened. Alina caught his eye across the table, the unspoken question passing between them. Is this real? For the first time, Damon was sure of the answer. Yes. Storms above and below. The rain came down in sheets, drumming against the windows of Alina's small apartment with a frantic urgency that matched the pounding of her heart. It had been 3 months since Damon stepped into their lives, awkward and unsure, but determined. Each day had been a cautious dance, 1 step forward, 2 steps back. Yet somehow, they hadn't fallen apart. Not yet. Alina stood at the sink, hands immersed in soapy water, scrubbing the same pot for the 3rd time. Across the room, Damon was sprawled on the floor with Sophia, assembling a puzzle she had spread out across the coffee table. Sophia's giggles filled the air, high and carefree, blending with the patter of rain. "No, Captain Pickle, the sky piece goes here, not in the middle of the castle." Sophia's voice was pure exasperation mixed with glee. Damon squinted at the mismatched piece in his hand, brow furrowed. "Are you sure? Maybe this castle has sky floors. You never know." Sophia collapsed into a fit of laughter, her curls bouncing as she clutched her sides. "Sky floors aren't real." "Neither are talking lambs," Damon countered, pointing at Lily, who was propped against the table with a plastic crown on her head. "Yet here we are." Alina's lips twitched into a smile she couldn't quite contain. It was too easy to want this. Too easy to imagine this fragile happiness was something they could hold on to. But Alina had spent years building walls to keep disappointment out, and no amount of silly jokes or Saturday puzzles could completely breach them. Her phone buzzed on the counter, pulling her back into reality. Robert Whittaker. The name sent a ripple of tension down her spine. Damon's world, with all its power and cold practicality, still lingered just outside their door. She silenced the call. Not tonight. Not here. Cracks in the foundation. Later, after Sophia was tucked in and Damon was rinsing off the last of the puzzle glue from his hands, Alina stood in the kitchen doorway, arms folded tight across her chest. "You haven't been to the office much," she said, her voice neutral and her eyes sharp. Damon dried his hands with a dish towel, deliberately avoiding her gaze. "I've been working remotely." "From here?" Her eyebrow arched. He leaned back against the counter, suddenly feeling the narrowness of the kitchen pressing in on him. "It's not a big deal." "It is if they come looking for you," Alina said, her tone softening slightly. "I know how your world works, Damon. They don't just let CEOs disappear without asking questions." He ran a hand through his hair, the weight of the truth pressing heavily against his shoulders. "The board's concerned, but I'm handling it. Are you? Elena's voice lowered. Because you're not just balancing spreadsheets and shareholders anymore. You're balancing her. She nodded toward Sophia's closed bedroom door. And if you drop her, even once, you'll break her. The words landed like stones in his stomach. He knew she was right. Every bedtime story, every awkward school pickup, every messy dinner. It was all laying bricks in the foundation of something Sophia was just beginning to trust. If it cracked, it wouldn't just hurt Elena this time. It would crush Sophia. I won't let that happen, Damon said, the quiet promise laced with rare vulnerability. Elena held his gaze, searching his face for cracks in the resolve. You'd better mean that. I do. But they both knew words were easy. Corporate ghosts. The next morning, Damon stepped outside the building to find Robert leaning against a sleek black town car parked at the curb. His expression was carefully neutral, but his presence alone spoke volumes. Running from something? Robert asked, his tone far too casual for the weight of his words. Damon's jaw tightened. I'm not running. Could have fooled me. Robert pushed off the car, straightening his tie. The board's restless. They don't like uncertainty. Neither do your investors. Damon's shoulders squared. My personal life isn't their concern. Robert gave a thin smile. It becomes their concern when the man they bet billions on starts hiding out in a two-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood where delivery drivers double-check the locks. Damon's fists clenched at his sides, but he forced himself to stay calm. What do you want, Robert? Clarity. Robert stepped closer. You're either in or out, but you can't have both. Family or empire. Damon's pulse hammered in his ears, but his voice stayed even. Watch me. Robert's smile didn't falter, but the steel in his eye sharpened. If you step down, you know they'll come for you. They'll dig. They'll use anything they can find, including her. He didn't say Elena's name, but the threat was clear enough. Damon's hands curled into fists at his sides. Stay away from them. Then make your choice. Robert slipped into the car, the tinted window gliding shut, leaving Damon standing alone on the cracked sidewalk, caught between two worlds, both ready to collapse if he chose wrong. The birthday that wasn't. It was a week later when Sophia's school sent home a crayon-colored invitation to a classmate's birthday party. A roller skating rink across town. Sophia danced around the kitchen with the invitation clutched to her chest. Will Captain Pickle come too? She asked, her excitement bubbling over. Elena's smile froze, her heart instinctively clenching. I'm sure he'll try. Sophia beamed, and Elena prayed that try wouldn't turn into a promise Damon couldn't keep. The day of the party arrived, and Sophia stood by the window, her pink roller skating outfit already on, her hair braided in two uneven pigtails. Every time a car passed, her head snapped up, her eyes hopeful. But the cars kept passing. Elena sat on the couch, her stomach knotted with dread. When Damon finally called, an hour after the party started, she answered without saying hello. I'm so sorry, his voice rasped on the line. There was an emergency board meeting. No. Elena's voice was sharp, her throat thick. You don't get to explain this to me. You explain it to her. There was silence on the other end. Then, put her on. Elena crossed the room, handing the phone to Sophia, who took it with small, trembling hands. Hello. From the couch, Elena watched her daughter's face, the flicker of hope, the softening smile, then the slow fade as Damon's voice filled her ear. Sophia's fingers clutched the phone tighter, her shoulders hunching inward as though bracing for something heavy. When she finally handed the phone back, she didn't cry. She didn't shout. She just curled up on the couch with Lily the lamb, her head resting against Elena's side. He's busy, Sophia whispered. Elena's heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. I know, baby. But she also knew something else. One missed party could become two. One excuse could turn into silence. One crack in Sophia's heart could break it entirely. Confrontation. That night, Damon stood outside the apartment, the rain plastering his hair to his forehead, his fists shoved deep into his pockets. When Alina opened the door, her face was cold, her exhaustion carved into every line. "She waited for you." "I know." She didn't cry. Alina's voice was quiet, but every word was sharp as glass. "That's worse." Damon stepped inside, his wet shoes squeaking against the linoleum. "It won't happen again." Alina's arms folded tightly across her chest, her eyes burning with fury and something dangerously close to disappointment. "Don't make promises you can't keep." This time, Damon didn't argue. He stood there, dripping rainwater onto the floor, feeling every ounce of the weight pressing down on him. "You can't have both," Alina said softly, echoing Robert's words from days before. "Not the Empire and the family." Damon looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, the choice didn't feel complicated. "I choose her." Alina's breath caught in her throat, her walls trembling under the weight of those words. "Then prove it," she whispered. The storm outside raged on, but inside, Damon took the first real step toward the life he'd nearly lost, and the family he wasn't willing to lose again. Foundations of love. The morning sun streamed through the thin curtains of Alina's living room, illuminating the patchwork quilt of their lives. Scuffed furniture, drawings taped to the fridge, shoes in a jumbled pile by the door. It wasn't luxury, but it was home. And for the first time, Damon Whittaker stood in the middle of it, feeling more grounded than he ever had in his glass-walled penthouse. Alina stood by the sink, her hands wrapped around a chipped coffee mug, watching him. She didn't speak. Not yet. The silence between them was delicate, like the space between waves. It was up to Damon whether this was the beginning or the end. Sophia's giggles drifted from the hallway, her voice full of sleepy morning joy as she argued with her stuffed lamb about what to wear. Every sound, every small comfort of this life, wrapped itself around Damon's chest, squeezing until he could barely breathe. He had spent his life chasing power, control over boardrooms, over markets, over every facet of his world. But here, in this small apartment, he had no control. No contracts, no guarantees. Just one chance to show them he was worth trusting. And trust wasn't a deal you could close. The first real goodbye. 3 hours later, Damon stood in front of the gleaming glass facade of Whittaker Global Holdings, his reflection a fractured ghost in the polished surface. He hadn't worn a suit today, just a simple button-down shirt, sleeves rolled up, the first time he'd walked into this building looking anything less than invincible. The receptionist stared, startled by the sight of him, dressed like any ordinary man, not the king of the 38th floor. When the elevator doors slid open, Robert Whittaker was already waiting outside Damon's office, his hands clasped behind his back, his face a mask of practiced calm. But his eyes, they flickered with thinly veiled disapproval. "You're late," Robert said smoothly. "I wasn't planning to come at all," Damon replied. "But I thought I owed them this." Robert's brow lifted. Them. The board, the shareholders, everyone who put their faith in me. Damon stepped past him into his office, the office that had been his kingdom. Everything was pristine, just as he'd left it. Notebooks perfectly aligned. A crystal decanter untouched, a family-sized emptiness in the air. Damon opened the drawer beneath his desk and pulled out a worn envelope. Inside was a resignation letter, handwritten, because some things shouldn't be typed. Robert stepped closer. "You don't have to do this." "Yes, I do." "There's a way to have both," Robert said, his voice softening, almost pleading. "You can be a father and still keep this." Damon's smile was faint, almost sorrowful. "I've spent my life telling myself that. I built this empire so I could have control. But I never had control, not over what mattered." He handed Robert the envelope. "I'm done." Robert's lips thinned, but he took the letter. "You walk away. They'll tear you apart. Every mistake you ever made, personal and professional, will be dragged into the light. Let them. Damon said, the weight in his chest lifting for the first time in years. For once, I'm not afraid of being seen. He didn't wait for Robert's response. He walked out of Whittaker Global, his footsteps light, leaving behind everything he once believed defined him. A life no longer borrowed. Elena was chopping vegetables for dinner when the knock came. It was soft, hesitant, not the sharp, sure knock of a delivery man or a landlord. She opened the door to find Damon standing there in jeans and a rumpled shirt, a brown paper bag in one hand, the faint smell of garlic bread trailing behind him. "Hungry?" he asked, with a small, crooked smile. Elena stared at him for a moment, her heart racing too fast, her hands trembling too much to answer. "You're not supposed to be here," she said quietly. "Shouldn't you be in some conference room?" "Not anymore." He stepped inside, setting the bag on the table. "I quit." The knife in her hand stilled, a half-sliced carrot frozen beneath the blade. "You? What?" "I walked away," Damon said softly. "From the company, the title, all of it." Elena shook her head, disbelief flickering in her eyes. "Why would you do that?" For her, his voice was steady, but the vulnerability was undeniable. "For you. For us." The weight of his words settled between them, too heavy and too fragile all at once. "You think quitting fixes everything." Elena's voice was sharp, but her eyes betrayed her. They shimmered with something dangerously close to hope. "No," Damon admitted, "but it's a start." Dinner for 3. Sophia was delighted to find garlic bread on the table. "You brought my favorite," she squealed, grabbing a piece in each hand. Damon laughed. "Captain Pickle delivers." The meal was simple: pasta, salad, bread, but it was filled with conversation, giggles, and Damon asking Sophia about her favorite cartoons and which of her classmates was the fastest on the playground. Elena watched quietly, her heart tangled in knots she couldn't untie. He was trying, genuinely trying, but she knew too well that good intentions weren't always enough. After dinner, Sophia dragged Damon to the couch, where she insisted on teaching him her made-up dance routine. He stumbled through the steps, Sophia giggling with every awkward move, until both of them collapsed into laughter, breathless and tangled together like family. Elena leaned against the kitchen doorway, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "I want to believe this is real," she said softly once Sophia was asleep. Damon met her gaze. "No mask, no defenses. Then let me show you it is." The night the past caught up. The next morning, Elena's phone buzzed with a notification that made her heart sink. A news alert. Damon Whittaker resigns. Personal scandal and secret daughter rock Whittaker Global Holdings. The article was brutal. Reporters had dredged up everything. Damon's past with Isabel, photos of Elena and Sophia leaving the Regal Heights building, speculation about payouts, and thinly veiled hints of corporate cover-ups. Elena's stomach twisted as her name, her home, her daughter's school were all laid bare for public consumption. When Damon arrived later that day, Elena was waiting with the phone in her hand. "You said you'd protect us." Her voice trembled with fury and fear. Damon took the phone, reading the article in silence. His face went pale, but he didn't look surprised. "I knew this would happen." "And you didn't warn me." Her voice rose, no longer caring if Sophia heard. "You let them drag us into your mess." "I tried," Damon said quietly, "but there's only one way to protect you now." Elena's breath caught. "What do you mean?" "I'm not hiding," Damon said. "I'm going to tell the truth. All of it." Her eyes widened. "That'll destroy you." Damon's smile was soft, almost peaceful. "It'll set us free." The press conference that wasn't about business. 2 days later, Damon stood in front of a crowded press room. The microphones and flashing cameras a familiar battlefield. But this time, he wasn't selling a merger. He was telling his story. "I made mistakes," he began, voice steady. "I chose ambition over love. I walked away from the woman I loved and the daughter I never knew existed. That was my failure." Cameras clicked furiously. Reporters leaned in. "But what I've found," Damon continued, "is that success means nothing if you have no one to share it with. I'm stepping away from Whitaker Global to focus on the only thing that matters, being a father." There were no questions he would answer. No spin, just the truth. A home not bought, but built. When Damon returned to Alina's apartment, Sophia met him at the door. "Did you tell them you're my daddy?" she asked, her wide eyes full of wonder. "I did," Damon said, kneeling to her level. "And I told them you're the best thing that ever happened to me." Sophia beamed, throwing her arms around his neck. Alina stood in the kitchen, watching them, her heart no longer fighting. "You're really staying?" she asked softly. Damon looked at her, the weight of 1,000 mistakes in his eyes, and the hope of a future built from them. For good. And this time, Alina believed him.